So it's very good to be with you. I'm here in Worthing in West Sussex in the southeast of England. And I'm grateful to Dennis for asking me to make a contribution this evening. When we were thinking about the subject of this talk, I came up with the title, Embracing Compassion, a Christian Response to Animals in a World of Human Dominion. But that wasn't very user-friendly for Facebook and other forms of media. So I took out the embracing compassion bit and left us with a Christian response to animals in a world of human dominion. But I think it's important to hang on to the idea of compassion, and it's something to which I will frequently return. For Christians, of course, and I'm not presuming everybody here is a Christian, but I hope that's okay. For Christians, compassion is at the heart of God, of course. In Psalm 102, we read, "The Lord is compassion and love, slow to anger and rich in mercy." Jesus expressed and lived compassion perfectly. It's a feature of his whole life. If we had to sum up one of the virtues that Jesus lived perfectly, it would, of course, be compassion. And he lived it perfectly because whilst remaining fully God, he was always, of course, also fully man. So compassion is at the heart of his ministry. And St. Paul, particularly in the letters of Colossians, but in a number of places, gives us compassion as something to which we might aspire. He says, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience." Those are the kind of virtues I'd like us to keep in mind this evening when we take on this subject. There's obviously also a reason why I use the word dominion that will be obvious to you all, that most Christians understand that it is dominion that God gives to human beings when he creates the world. It's very much the word that is the buzzword around the creation story and the relationship that God at least appears to give to human beings in terms of how they interact with everything they see around them. But I want to unpack that concept a little bit more as we go on. So what do compassion and dominion look like for Christians, and what do compassion and dominion require of Christian believers, particularly in terms of our relationship with creation and very particularly in terms of our relationship with non-human animals? Just to put myself briefly into context, I'm a Catholic priest of some 25 years, but I've had experience of other denominations. I work with people of other denominations and faiths, and indeed with those of no faith. I am accustomed as a Catholic to referring to God as he, and I may fall into that trap, and I hope you'll forgive me. It is just a habit. It's what we do in the Catholic Church. And also when talking about human beings, we still use the word man to refer to humankind in the Catholic Church. So there's no offence attended if I fall into those habits, and no political scoring going on. Finally, I would want to say what I'm suggesting tonight is, of course, not the final word on how Christians can be invited to understand animals in creation. I don't have any authority to say anything like that. There are, of course, brilliant theologians out there, and I can make some gentle suggestions about further reading at the end of this talk if it's helpful. But I'm really speaking as someone who cares passionately about animals, but who also loves my Catholic faith and really wants to see the two come together much more closely. To understand me best, it's just easy to see me at the end of the day as an ordinary pastor or parish priest, sharing my thoughts on what is an important matter for each of us, hence our time together this evening. So 3 brief sections. Firstly, What do Christians believe about creation and dominion? And I've come up with a 3-point creed that I think sums up where Christians, drawing on their Jewish heritage, particularly in the Old Testament, come from. That is, Christians believe that God created the world and all that is within it. Christians believe that God hates nothing that he has created, and Christians believe that therefore God always creates out of love and for love. All this, of course, is backed up by scripture and centuries of church teaching. I don't want to be constantly referring back to scripture passages, but if there's any point afterwards in the questions and answers where I need to be more specific about biblical reflections, please do ask. You all know, of course, very well that in Genesis there are two creation narratives, in chapter 1 and in chapter 2. Those narratives, along with other biblical creation accounts, like we find, for example, in Psalm 104 and in the final chapters of the book of Job, really attempt to do the impossible. They want to tell us how the world came into being. We might take them as factual descriptions. We're free to do so, take the word at face value, or we might take them as allegorical. We're equally free to do so. Either way, they tell us what Christians and Jews believe about how God created the world. So they are not unimportant. And some scholars, trying to get behind these two chapters in Genesis, suggest that God creates because he can't help himself. It's something he needs to do because his love has to be expressed creatively. It's not static. It has to go out from him. So that genuine love cannot contain itself and must find some kind of tangible expression. The scholars tell us that God's love is seen in this fruitful and material way, actually in his creation. He cannot resist but to pour forth his love. We would all agree, I'm sure, anyway, that authentic love is, after all, always creative, always focused on the other, and always fruitful. What is interesting about the creation story in Genesis 1 is that there is no attempt to tell us why God creates the world and all that is within, just that he creates. Nowhere in the scriptures is the why looked into. Simply, the scriptures tell us that creation just is. Sticking with Genesis 1 for a moment, in the 6 days of creation, God brings into being everything on the earth as we know it, light and dark, day and night. He brings in the sky, the land, the seas and plants. He creates creatures of the air, the sea and the land, and finally, human beings. Before we get to the human beings, God says that all he has created is good, and that the creatures should go forth and multiply, as it were, inviting the creatures to model God's own creative energy by recreating and regenerating themselves. That is a blessing indeed, to share in the very nature of God by recreation and regeneration. So before we briefly look at humans, because we need to for context, let's stay with non-human animals and with the rest of creation. And in this particular way of looking at it, revisit those 3 creedal statements I made at the beginning about what Christians believe. And I believe that we can now say that Christians believe that God created all animals, human and non-human, that God hates nothing that he has created, and therefore that God creates animals, human and non-human, out of love and for love. They are always the fruit of his creative purpose and love. And we need to bear that very much in mind. Genesis 1 tells us that human beings, of course, are made in the image of God and that they too are good. I don't think it's helpful for me to set humans and animals against each other, because I think the text is very clear that they coexist and that they live harmoniously. So all these creatures, the human and the non-human animals, along with the plants and seeds, are there to thrive and to populate the earth. And they support one another in this creative, divine outgoing, if you like. Everything is as God has willed it to be. It is, if you like, heaven on earth. Human beings survive, interestingly, at this stage, by divine mandate on fruit and seeds and plants. All is very, very good. And even in the Genesis creation story of chapter 2, which actually is historically the earlier one of the two, where Adam is created from the dust of the earth, all the animals are then brought to him to name. And it's as if in naming them, he honors them. He gives them their place within creation. So they are coexisting happily for all to see. As you know so well, it's not much later until after the fall and then the flood that God kind of grudgingly, reluctantly lets human beings eat meat, because he accepts that they are now fallen and he needs to kind of win them round. So there's a lot of give and take. But in this early part of Genesis, that's very much not the case. They coexist, they live together, and they all exist on fruit and plants together. Notice that nowhere in the text does God tell one species that it exists for another. All coexist beautifully and harmoniously in the peaceable kingdom. Now, with Genesis and any biblical texts, we have to take them as they are because it's all we have. We cannot adopt them to mean what we want them to mean or translate them according to our own agendas. The text is what it is. And as it is, it's shaped and fashioned all of what Christians believe about creation. We are told unequivocally and clearly that dominion belongs to humans, and that this dominion is given to humans by God himself. This is important because I think the Christian will always want to understand dominion through the life and teaching of Jesus Christ. And this is an important matter. The Old Testament is always seen for the Christian through the lens of the life of Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of the old and the establishment of the new. The Old Testament is filled with wars and sacrifices and murder and even an angry deity. But the coming of Jesus and the establishment of the new kingdom of love and joy and peace wipes all that away. We, with everything else, are a new creation in Christ. Everything in creation in Christ takes on a new and more significant meaning through him and with him and in him. So that dominion is there and it is given. The text is clear, but we want to interpret that text through the lens of the love and the compassion of Jesus, who brings in a new kingdom. The difficulty is an understanding of dominion has been accepted through the generations as a kind of human superiority and not as this compassionate coexistence about which I'm speaking. And this human superiority has been understood to be not just over animals, but over the whole planet. Maybe we're facing some of the ecological problems we now face because of this what I might suggest is an arrogant attitude. The concept of human superiority is so embedded in human history that even complete atheists and unbelievers are habitually caught up with the idea. So even those who have no reference to the Genesis concept of dominion can believe quite freely, because it's so much in the heart of the human race now, that we are sort of demigods, if you like, all powerful, all intelligent, and I would suggest all self-consumed. So it is in this context that Christians need to struggle with the challenge of presenting a new Christ-like, compassionate model of dominion. We're not helped in that either by the Catholic Church, I have to say. The great Catholic theologian known as the Angelic Doctor, who basically has formed pretty much the majority of what Catholic Christians now believe, St. Thomas Aquinas, writing his epic work, the Summa Theologica, in the late 13th century, has a huge part to play in cementing this anthropocentric, this humanocentric idea in the mind of believers at a time which is pre-Reformation. So when pretty much believers in the West were Catholic, if they were Christian, which most of them were, at least culturally and habitually. So he has this huge influence. And even after the Reformation, that influence goes into the churches of the Reformation, who see humankind as somehow lording it over creation, over animals, and over the whole of creation. He says in the Summa that God made animals exclusively for human use. We ride, wear, work, and eat animals, and there is no sin in using a thing for the purpose for which it has been created. He quite happily talks about animals as things. In another place, he describes them as kind of machines who have some sort of feelings. He states that because animals are not rational, unlike human animals, they have no soul in a religious sense and are therefore inferior to humans. Now, he does talk about them having a sensitive soul, which is unlike the human rational soul, but it's not a soul as we would understand it today. He's talking about the very thing that motivates them to eat and drink and to run around and all the things they do. It's not the soul as we would understand it. And he's drawing very much on Aristotle to get that concept. He draws so much on Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. So to Aquinas, and therefore to the Catholic Church, at least since about 1280, then animals are things and we are superior to them. And we're still struggling with that. So it does sound a bit clunky to the modern ear, this idea of animals as machines, but this is where so much of our Christian tradition comes from, and therefore where so much of our attitudes to animals in society comes from. Aquinas sees humanity alone as the sum and center of God's creation, and animals are only valuable inasmuch as they help human beings to function. Well, I hope I haven't overlabored the Genesis stories and the Aquinas thing, but that is important to see because that is where we're coming from. So my second heading is Christian hope and compassion. So we're moving away from the Old Testament very much to the new now. Just going to have a swig. I believe strongly that all those who try and follow Jesus Christ and therefore to live a Christian life are called, despite what Aquinas tells us and the tradition would have us believe, are called to give animals special moral consideration and attention. Far be it from me, a mere pastor, Catholic priest, under the authority of the church, to dismiss the angelic doctor's teaching. But it's also true to say that more and more modern theologians are humbly questioning his stance and taking a new view about how coexistence and a sense of sharing the planet are God's plans for us and for the whole of creation, including Pope Francis in Laudato Si. I also believe that giving animals particular consideration and attention is the vocation of all Christians, even the ones not drawn to liking or caring about animals. This is not about cutesy kittens. This is about animals deserving, in the name of Christ, to be seen as creations of the Creator in and of themselves, valuable for their contribution to the working of the world, and I would say the fruitful upbuilding of God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. But also because they, like us, are children of God, created out of love and for love. To give them their rightful place in the created order is to honor the God who created them for that purpose. They should be treated with compassion and with love. And the belief of the Christian in Jesus means that each individual follower seeks to unite their life to his and model their lives on his, becoming, some of the saints would say, Jesus in the world, if you will. The call of the Christian is to become another Christ, speaking his words, loving with his heart, making real his life and ministry in the Christian's own life and ministry. There is a kind of dying to the self that replicates Christ dying to himself on the cross, which is required of all Christians. The church teaches that humans are created in such a way that the more we become like Jesus, the more completely ourselves we become. And I suggest that this has implications for how we treat the rest of creation, and especially for how we treat animals. Those who believe in Jesus and try to follow him as Christians find his words inspiring and encouraging. He lives peace and justice, compassion and mercy perfectly, as we've said. He speaks of a kingdom to come where there will be no violence or death, and where all will live together in harmony. His will appears to be for non-violence and peace for all creation. Those who pray the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, ask indeed that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. To me, the Jesus of the Beatitudes, who says that the poor in spirit will inherit the kingdom, and that the meek will inherit the earth, that the merciful will be shown mercy, and that those who thirst after righteousness will be satisfied, that peacemakers are his children, is calling his followers to make real here and now the kingdom of heaven on earth. In that kingdom, surely, I would suggest, violence and cruelty to any of God's creation cannot be appropriate, especially from humans to animals. Avoidance of animal violence must mean a restoration of Genesis 1 and the treating of animals as our friends and not our food, since so much violence is caught up in the taking of animal lives for food. I believe Jesus is calling us to live together in that peaceful kingdom ruled by the peace-loving God who Jesus reveals, the Jesus who came not to be served, but to serve. The Jesus who called for the sheep to be pulled from the pit in the ground, even though it meant breaking the Sabbath, and who said that even one sparrow is not forgotten in God's sight. The Jesus who said that the birds of the air are fed by their Heavenly Father. This is the kind of dominion on which we might reflect, the kind revealed in the person of Jesus, who interprets his very real lordship, not in terms of domination, but as servanthood. If we are to become like Christ, then this applies to all Christians, using our God-given gifts to serve and protect the most vulnerable. This obviously includes vulnerable animals as well as human beings. With Jesus as our guide, our human stewardship or trusteeship of creation must be about self-sacrificial love, not greed or consumerist exploitation or power over the weak and the voiceless. There needs to be a radical Christian revolution about how we treat creation. I strongly suggest that in the name of Jesus, God's intent was a human race that did not and does not eat animals or animal products, the peaceable kingdom in which they are companions and animals are not food, each with their distinct role and purpose, creating a balance brought about by coexistence. The prophets of the Old Testament tell us again and again that not only does God not want any more animal sacrifices, but that the peaceful kingdom between humans and animals is coming. Christians need to embrace this reality and work harder to assist its advent, though, as we know, it's not at all easy. The boundless compassion for creation and for animals from Jesus is witnessed in the gospel, as I've already quoted, and in the broad strokes of St. Paul, who in that famous passage from Romans 8 longs for the day when Christ will release the whole of creation, presumably including animals and plants, from its groaning bondage. Groaning bondage. What an apt description of what goes on in slaughterhouses and factory farms. Paul says he longs for the day when Christ will release the whole of creation from that bondage. The same Christ will make peace between all things on heaven and on earth, says St. Paul in both Colossians and Ephesians. All things, not just between humans, but between humans and animals and plants and the whole of creation. Maybe the whole of the cosmic order is implied here, the planets as well. So it's time for Christians to make a difference and to stand up and be counted for the suffering and the poor, the animals and humans with which we share the earth. There is no excuse. Nothing can excuse the violence and cruelty which is so endemic in the consumerist chains which bring animals to the table as food. I'm sure none of you need me to explain further. The Jesus whom Christians seek to serve and follow is the Jesus who received the Holy Spirit like a dove, compared his love to that of mother hens, and declared that even the most economically worthless of birds are all receivers of God's providential care and do not fall outside the love of the Father. Even though, sadly, we live in a society where male chicks in their millions have their few short hours of life ended by being minced alive in an industrial macerator each week, and where millions of birds travel along a conveyor belt before falling into those whirring blades, for the Christian, not one of them falls outside the love of the Father. So Christians need to act. It really is time to make a difference and to declare that in the name of Jesus, the Christian way is not the way of commodification and utilitarianism and speciesism. Well, I hope that didn't sound too much like a sermon. It's a bit of an occupational hazard, I'm afraid. So I'm going to end a bit more light-heartedly. These are serious matters and they deserve serious attention. But my last section is simply called Saints, Souls, and Animals. Because there's been a long tradition in Christianity of saints caring for and learning from animals. And arguably, the most famous, of course, is St. Francis, and Pope Francis is Francis because of his own concern for creation. And within the life of Francis, we hear the story of the wolf of Gubbio. Maybe you know it, where a wolf begins terrorizing the citizens of Gubbio and starts by catching and eating their livestock, and then one day catches a human being and decides he prefers to eat human beings. And the people of Gubbio become terrified. They won't leave the city. No one will go outside the city walls. And Francis decides on visiting Gubbio that he will tame the wolf, which is exactly what he does with a sign of the cross, and promises the wolf that he will stop eating animals and human beings and live peaceably with the people of Gubbio. They will ensure that he is well looked after for the rest of his life on earth. Now, the most interesting thing about that story is not whether it's true or not. There's a similar story about St. Macarius and the hyena. In a way, the most interesting thing about the story is that it survives. And Francis lived in the 13th century, and that story is still told today. It pops up on Wikipedia if you type in Gubbio. It's a very popular story. Somehow in the tradition, we have found it helpful to associate animals with holiness. And don't forget, of course, the word for soul in Latin is anima. So somewhere along the line, we gave animals a name that's very linked to the concept of soul. The word saint means holy, and it's fascinating that many holy men and women through the ages have felt a sympathy for animals and have preached to them and learned from them. St. Basil the Great is a saint of the Eastern Orthodox Church. He wrote a great deal in favor of animals. A lot of scholars call him Basil of Caesarea, either because they're not Christians themselves or because they're Christians of a tradition that doesn't have saints as such. But it's the same man. And in the Eastern Orthodox masses, he inserted this prayer: "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. O God, enlarge within us the sense of fellowship with all living things, our brothers the animals, to whom you have given the earth as their home in common with us. We remember with shame that in the past we have exercised the high dominion of man with ruthless cruelty, so that the voice of the earth, which should have gone up to you in song, has been a groan of travail. May we realize that these animals live not for us alone, but for themselves and for you, and that they love the sweetness of life." I've looked closely at the Catholic liturgy, the modern Catholic liturgy, and there are references in some of the Eucharistic prayers to creation in its entirety, being created by God, being holy because it's created by God. But it's not as evident as Basil the Great is there in that Eastern Orthodox part of their Mass. We know of St. Anthony of Egypt, who healed a pig who would never then leave his side and became his constant companion. St. Gertrude is often depicted holding a cat because of her love for stray animals, and she always insisted they were given a home at the convent. St. Cuthbert frequently fed and preached to the birds, and he, as a penance, would stand waist deep in the icy waters of the sea to pray. 2 otters, it is said, came and warmed his frozen feet. St. Philip Neri was a trailblazer and a vegetarian, specifically because he cared about animals. And once, when walking past a butcher's shop, scolded those who bought God's creatures as food. He set free a brace of live partridge that he had been given for a meal, and he insisted on flies being allowed to escape through the window rather than being harmed. The list goes on, and there are many of them, and they're just the ones that we know about. This link between holiness and animals is very interesting. So, do animals have a soul? We can't say. We can certainly hope, and we can look at them and have a sense that because they're created out of love and for love, they might well have an idea of the divine, who knows? But I would certainly suggest that for the Christians, they must be seen, these animals, as God created and therefore worthy of being treated as God would treat them. That is their right. They kind of have rights under God because they are created by God. Christians worship a merciful, compassionate God who in turn calls them to act mercifully and compassionately towards all of his creation, and especially towards the weak and the voiceless. If they have souls, then animals deserve that they, if they have souls, they deserve to be treated kindly because they already share in the triune life of God. If they don't have souls, then their only experience of life is here and now, and therefore deserve to be treated well so that at least their short life on earth is a happy one. So either way, ensouled or not ensouled, they deserve kindness and compassion. If the tradition is correct and that they are thought to be wanting of souls, God help us as a human race for the way we exploit and cruelly commodify so many billions of animals every year. Christians, at least, should be ashamed of themselves. So I'd like to end by returning to our creedal statements, which have somewhat expanded and been slightly modified. Christians believe then that imitating the love of Jesus means always behaving in non-violent ways. Christians believe that imitating the love of Jesus means having a preference for the most vulnerable. Christians believe that imitating the love of Jesus means resisting love of money, profit, and consumerism, which is a kind of sacrificing animals to idols. Christians believe that human beings are called to be good stewards of God's creation by God himself and to care for it with Jesus as our primary example of what good stewardship looks like. Christians believe that all creation, not just some of it, is created good by God independently of the interest of human beings. And Christians believe that animals are created to be our friends and companions, not our food. Let's leave the last word with Isaiah's prophecy of that peaceable kingdom with which we're all so familiar. The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. I think I've said quite enough, so over to you guys.
So, Terry, do I call you Terry, Mr. Martin, or
Terry,
father, or?
Terry is fine. Call me what you like, just not late for dinner.
Okay. Yeah, any swear word will do. Yeah, okay. I found that really interesting. That end section was really interesting. But I wanted to go back to a main theme of yours, which was dominion.
Yeah.
And try and tie it in with the concerns of Sentient Rights Island a little bit, in the sense that, I mean, I wrote about what Jim Mason called Dominionism, or rituals of Dominionism, in my PhD. And as you said, often dominion was interpreted as human superiority. When it wasn't, it was brought down to stewardship, and you didn't mention that word, right? And so you got people like Andrew Lindsay, Tony Sargent, kind of in that kind of area. The real issue there is that stewardship and animal welfare is very similar ideas. And so I just wonder whether, as it were, in the light of what Sentient Rights Island wants to do, which is kind of inject rights into this situation, whether in the scriptures or in your position, you could move from welfare to rights. Does that make sense? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think I'd be drawing on Andrew Lindsay, really. And I referred briefly to his main idea that animals have rights because God has rights and he created them. So it's not purely about welfare, but it's about them existing in and of themselves as ends in themselves because they're created by God.
Good. Well, because I know one concern of Dennis and other members of the Sentient Rights Island is that when we've had other animals now being declared as sentient beings, that has been interpreted as that means that their welfare needs to be improved, rather than that because they're sentient beings they have rights. And so that that kind of was kind of like the basis of where I was coming from in the first place, really.
Yeah, and I think the preferential option for the poor of the Gospels and of the life of Jesus Christ is not just about patting them on the head or even putting money in their bank accounts. It's about recognizing them as created by God and having dignity and deserving to be treated as people with dignity. Because they're created by God, and I would extend that to animal rights as well. The preferential option for the poor and vulnerable is not just about welfare, but about recognizing autonomy and treating people respectfully and with dignity because of the respect and dignity they are given by God.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got a couple of other points, but I'll let others talk right now.
Thank you, Father Terry, for the talk tonight. I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was a tour de force. My question is this: it's more of a personal nature, and it's something I'm always intrigued about with the different people we have on here. What brought you to veganism is what I'm interested in. Your own story. That's what I'd love to know. Thank you.
It's very simple, really. I wanted to be vegetarian when I was younger, and my family and those around me were not supportive of the idea, and I wasn't strong enough to push it anyway. And then I decided I would have a canine companion. And one day, I'm deeply fond of him, both of my dogs. And one day, while he was sat on my lap, I was tucking into a piece of roast beef. And I thought, my goodness, this could be Pepe. Because that cow has as much right to live and not suffer as the rights to live and not suffer that I give to Pepe. So it was an overnight change for me, and I emptied the fridge and started anew, and I've never looked back. So yeah, it was making the connection between a companion animal and the world of animals much more broadly?
Well, thank you very much. That's me. I'll be in touch with you afterwards because I want to get some of the copies of the poems and the transcripts that you read out, please.
Okay, sure.
Thank
I
you.
have a few comments and a question. So first of all, I wanted to thank you very, very much for that talk. I think your work is incredibly important. I'm a fellow actually at the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics, so I'm familiar with Andrew's work.
Yeah,
And,
I'm coming on the summer school in a couple of weeks.
Oh, so am I.
Oh, great.
So I'll see you there, yeah.
Yes.
But I think that I suppose to come and address maybe something about what Roger said and Andrew's work and what you're saying. And it's just kind of something I'm working on at the moment. I lecture in law, and I think I certainly agree that the welfare protection for animals really isn't any protection. And the granting of sentience to animals in European law, actually what it does is it doesn't really do anything. It slightly improves welfare law, but then, you know, we all know that it's never enforced. And then the other thing too is that, I mean, a recognition in the law that animals can feel pain, it's mitigated by provisions in the legislation that you can't inflict unnecessary cruelty. So in other words, there's necessary cruelty, and that's for humans to decide. So then
Catechism of the Catholic Church makes the same point, sadly. Yeah.
Yeah, and who even sets that? It's just ridiculous. Like the Animal Health and Welfare Act that governs the area in Ireland, if it were applied, it wouldn't allow any abuse of animals at all because it requires so much, but that's never acted on. It's just ignored because it would be impossible. They expect courts to assess the physiology of animals and, you know, all these criteria. One of the problems with just confining the protection of animals to rights alone is that rights are very much based on property. I mean, they're a colonial construct and they're individualistic. So I totally agree with the point of, you know, well, I partly agree anyway with the point about, you know, recognizing certain animals as persons is problematic because they're always based on individual cases which tug at the heartstrings. It really doesn't address industrialized farming at all. And so I think that one of the areas that Andrew really contributes is this kind of virtue ethics, that I've got a moral responsibility. And that never really comes into the discussion at all. It's like animals as individuals have got rights, but who then is actually going to act on that? There's still a human controller. So to bring in that kind of missing link of, I've also got an obligation to treat animals well, I think that's why your work and Andrew's work is so important, because it comes back to the individual. It's not sort of that the animals, they've got rights and that's going to be taken care of, or, you know, if it's violated, you're going to have a prosecutor or something like that. It's actually, it comes back to the individual and, you know, what they've got to do. And a quick comment on Aquinas. Aquinas is so problematic.
Yeah.
Because, you know, when you look at, I mean, everything that he said about animals not being rational, he said the same thing about women.
Yeah.
And we've had to fight through that.
Yeah.
And I think that probably the next frontier is that, you know, animals have to be, or their status has to be reassessed. So I'll leave it at that.
Yes.
And I'll see you in a few weeks. And thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Early on, you were saying to appease the human race, God let them eat the animals. But
Yeah.
you also say that the animals and the human beings were treated as equal. I mean, could you not have equally have said that God would allow the humans to eat each other too, if they're going to be treated it's a bit ambiguous when you say he allowed them to eat the animals to appease them, to win them over again. Why wouldn't they eat each other and that be just as acceptable as eating animals at that stage?
Yeah. I mean, that's just my passing interpretation of Genesis 9, where the permission is given, and God gives permission to eat animals. He doesn't talk about eating each other or cannibalism. No. But I can see the logical connection, I guess, because of that superiority complex, that anthropocentrism that is so evident. They wouldn't eat each other when they can eat somebody that's beneath them. In that context,
yes. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah,
it's post-lapsarian. Yes. It's after the fall, so things are radically different. And God sends the flood because He hates sin so much, and it's like He's giving human beings a pass to try and win them back. That's just my interpretation. It's perhaps not the most theological.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Yes. I also wonder, is there a meaning behind it when you look at the nativity? There's always animals in the nativity there with like a newborn child.
Yeah, I mean,
there's a mixture of animals there too.
The nativity stories in the text don't really speak of animals. The animals are always there, not least because Francis put them there when he created the crib for the first time. Mm-hmm. And they're there by implication because it's a cattle stall.
Yes,
but if you actually look at the text, at that point at the nativity, the animals are not there. Of course, the angels go to the shepherds, who no doubt had sheep with them, but the text is all we've got. And obviously, artistic license allows us to build other things in, and that's not a bad thing.
Right. Okay. Right. Thank you very much, Father. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Right. Yes.
Father Terry,
hello.
You managed to convert any of your congregation?
That I don't know. I have hopefully raised a few questions, and I've certainly had lots and lots and lots of conversations. And people who've tried and then failed, and I've tried to encourage to get back on track. As you perhaps know, it's not an easy journey, bringing other people on board.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Father Terry, for that. It's really encouraging, motivating, inspiring.
I hope so.
One of the things that I run into a lot when I speak to my fellow Christian friends about veganism is the story related to the distribution of loaves and fishes, and the obvious fact that so many of the disciples were engaged in fishing. I wonder how it would be possible to extend or transform this idea of dominion to compassion, to reframe it as you're proposing, and deal also with the fact that Jesus is not distributing carrots or rutabagas, but fish.
Yes.
And indeed, helps Peter with the catching this overload of fish. So anyway, how do you reconcile those things?
And indeed, there are a number of occasions where it appears that Jesus eats fish himself, not least in one of his resurrection appearances. So again, the text is the text. We have to work with what we've got, and we can't. Sometimes you read articles of people saying, well, it wasn't fish, it was some kind of plant. I don't think that gets us anywhere really, because you're then, how many angels dance on a pinhead? It's who's translating and who's the authentic translator. So I think we have the text as it is. I think Jesus may have eaten fish. He may have needed that particular source of protein in a way that we don't, when there weren't supermarkets. And we're called to live the life of Jesus in the 21st century, not in Palestine at that time. So we don't speak Aramaic, we don't wear flowing robes and sandals, and we don't, as it happens, walk on water generally, although that's perhaps a logical fallacy. But you know, what we need to do is say factory farms didn't exist then, and factory farms exist now. Can you equate Jesus eating one piece of cooked fish with the slaughter of 10,000 salmon an hour in a fish factory farm? I don't think you can. And I think you can also say that the incarnation means that Jesus is a man, a human being man of his time. And yes, he called people to radical change, but at the same time, he needed to live as others around him were living, not least for things like sustenance. So I think it's about what would Jesus ask of us now, rather than what Jesus did then. Otherwise, we'd all be speaking Aramaic and sitting down with just 13 people every time we celebrate Mass on the floor around a table with no legs. You know, that really is what we're up against. How do I apply the reality of the life of Jesus to my life today? You know, not how can I go back and live as if I lived in first century Palestine. It's not an easy.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Well, we seem to have come up on the hour as well, and I don't see anybody else coming forward for questions, so we might do a wrap, Father Terry, unless there's something you want to add.
I don't think so, thanks. I think I've said enough, frankly. The only thing I would say, maybe briefly, is to recommend all of Andrew Lindsay's stuff, as we've said, and that's Linzey. He's an Anglican priest, and an Oxford Don, a PhD, a professor, and he's written, I would think, about 20 volumes on animals and theology, animals and ethics, animals and philosophy, some of them more light-hearted than others, but anything by him is worth reading. He's also written other books on other subjects. But from a Catholic point of view, I would recommend Charles Camozzi, an American philosopher, university lecturer, who wrote For Love of Animals. There's a slightly unusual chapter in this that I couldn't quite get my head around, but the rest of it is very good. I'd recommend that. And also this by an English or Welsh woman, The School of Compassion, by Deborah M. Jones, who's an ex-religious. And for example, she takes apart the catechism line by line. So there's just 4 paragraphs about animals and how we should treat animals in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And she looks at them line by line very, very helpfully. And then finally, I'm sure many of you would know, he's not a Catholic writer, this by David L. Clough on animals, a 2-volume work, one on theology and one on ethics. Absolutely outstanding. He's a Methodist minister, so I would recommend that as well. And it's paragraphs 215 through 2415 through 2418 if you want to look at what the Catechism says. But it starts well and ends less well.
Hello, Father Terry. Yeah, I very much enjoyed listening to your talk and the answers to the questions you gave. No, I just wanted to say hello because I've attended online your daily masses through the webcam, and you certainly are very much into the Catholic faith, and you seem to be able to have a lot of altar servers. I notice you've got.
I don't know how that's happened, but we've got 27 altar servers, and if they're not at school, they come. It's like the old days, you know, when they used to come to Mass before school and they were allowed to be late going to school. But now when there's no school, they all turn out, and they seem to love coming. I don't know what that's about, but it's lovely.
Yeah. No, but I really, your masses are inspiring. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Glory be to God.
Father Terry, thank you very much for this evening, and I really enjoyed that talk, and I think it'll do a lot of good in the world. I want to thank everybody else for coming, and the people who asked the questions, and everybody who attended. It's been a very uplifting evening for me anyway. So good night, everybody, and we'll have the recorded video with the good work of Peter, and thank Carol as well for production. All the best.
God bless. Bye.